Almost 2 million Cubans live in the United States, but they've been changing. Guillermo Grenier left when he was 9. He became a sociologist and has researched, doing polls, the Cuban-American community. He teaches at the Florida International University, and we talked to him to know when and how that change in his hometown, Miami, will express in the congressional politics. We made the interview in the office of Cuba, the first Cuban-American media opened in this island. I want to start, Professor, with a stereotype that exists in United States, but not only in United States, I would say even in Cuba, that the Cuban-American community is Republican, is conservative, is anti-Cuba or anti-Cuban government, right-wing, and that's the stereotype. But you've studied a lot that community with actual numbers.
Right.
Is that only now a stereotype?
Well, all stereotypes have their basis in some kind of truth, objective truth. And the fact is that for most of the time since 1959, since the revolution, Triunfo de la Revolución, right? If you were to interview Cuban Americans in Miami, you would find that stereotype very much alive. But what's happening? The Cubans have been coming, Cubans from the island. That's the only place you produce Cubans, really, is Cuba. And Cubans have been leaving the island almost continuously, but it's been dripping pretty steadily since 1959. And the Cubans that came in 1959 are different than the Cubans that are coming now. The Cubans that came in 1980 are different than the ones that came in 1959, and are different than the ones that are coming now. So you have varieties of Cubans. You have vintages of Cubans that have different attitudes about not only the United States, and they leave a different Cuba that the others left, and they arrive at a different United States that the others have left. So I would say the stereotype still holds for certain portions of the Cuban-American community. I'm doing some in-depth analysis of that very same presentation that you saw now, and I'm finding some very interesting things. The earlier exiles, say before 1964, have a very hard line, but the ones that have actually a harder position towards Cuban government now are the ones that came in the Puente Aéreo. They evidently had more of a shock.
That's the middle 60s?
From 65 to 73. And from 65 to 73, there was regular flights, but there weren't, you couldn't book it at the travel agency. It was regular, but it was starting after the Camarioca, opening of Camarioca, the two countries decided to rationalize the process of leaving, of departure. And the U.S. government for once and the Cuban government cooperated in creating these regular weekly flights, twice weekly flights. And those groups, that group, however, I'm theorizing as to why they might have had a harder line, but I think they had a very rough time. Once they declared their exit from the island, they had a rough time in the island, leaving. They had a rough time at their job site. It was just not a good time. It was a bad time for Cuba in general, and for people to be leaving, and they wasn't taken well. So they had a rough time. So you had the 64s, and then up to 73, you had people that fit that stereotype, I would say. After that, it becomes less fixed. The Marielitos, as we call them in Miami, are not as hardline. But then again, don't fit that stereotype that you're talking about. And then the folks that have come since 1995, 300,000, which is a huge number.
The majority?
Yeah, almost.
After the 2000s?
After 1995. Actually, after 1995 to the present, that's 20 years, about 300,000, a little over 300,000 Cubans have left the islands for the United States. And it's various periods of your own migration policy on the island. But it's a large number. It's about over a third of Miami. 35% of Miami now has arrived in Miami from the island since 1995. Those folks don't have anything to do with the earlier exiles, neither in context of departure or context of arrival. And they really do have a Cuban life. They have reasons to maintain contacts. They have reasons to want to normalize relations above and beyond the political reasons. They have family here. So there's
That's why you say that demographic change has brought political change.
That's right. The demographic changes are pushing towards the inevitability of having a transnational community of Cubans. Because it becomes very obvious to me doing these polls. I've done these polls since 1991. Not every year, probably every 2 years. I've done a total of 12 polls, I think. And what's very clear is that the number of respondents that I'm getting from the earlier exiles are shrinking, right? The biological solution is taking hold. So pretty soon, I don't know when, if I keep doing these polls, I don't know if I will, but if I continue doing these polls, the people that will answer if I ask them when did you come, there'll be people like me that came as little kids before 1964, because the folks that came older would all be dead. So that number is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and the number that's growing and growing and growing are the recent arrivals. So those are the folks that really have a more open attitude towards relations, because they have a horse in the race, as we say. They have a reason to want change. And those are also the folks that are more likely to be going back and forth. So they want prices of tickets to be natural and normal in a free market capitalist economy, right? Not to be,
as expensive and hard to get.
As expensive, they are $500 a trip. So they have a lot of reasons to want change, and those are the ones that are pushing the political change.
And that's my next question, Professor, because you talk about how this demographic change has promoted a political change, but we don't see that in the voting process. Still, the representatives and senators in Congress are anti-Cuba. They promote laws that separates both countries. Why is not that community expressed in its majority, expressed on the new arrivals and all that, is expressed in the Congress?
Right, and I think it's a matter of time. It's a matter of time. It will happen. But a couple of things have to happen first. According to our numbers, the most recent arrivals, well, even taking it back to 1995, when the new migration laws came into effect, only 31% of the Cubans that have arrived since 1995 are citizens. So first they have to become citizens. Evidently, it's not a priority. It is not a necessity, for sure, to become involved again in politics. And to be truthful, I think a lot of the ethnographic studies show that a lot of the Cubans that are recent arrivals, they're up to here, as we say, hasta aquí, with politics. They are not really interested in becoming involved politically. They kind of have a sense that in the United States nothing is going to change. So they haven't quite become,
or at least they're not there to change anything.
Yeah, and right. So they're not. For them, they have other priorities, and eventually, though, okay. So that's one step. They have to become citizens. So the needle's got to move a little bit.
In order to vote, they need to be citizens.
That's right.
And how much, according to your numbers, how much of them are citizens or get the citizenship?
Only 31% of the ones.
That's low.
That's very low. So if you push that over 50%, you push it. But it looks really low when you compare it to the early arrivals. The ones that came in the 60s, 95% are, 99% are citizens. Most of them are citizens. And 95% are registered to vote. So that's the two steps that you need. You need to become a citizen, and then you have to register to vote. Now, within the U.S. Political system, there are mechanisms that parties have to get people registered. They can go out and beat the bushes and get people to register to vote. But if they're not citizens, then they're not in the game at all. So you have a necessity for these newer arrivals to become citizens in order to change the political landscape. And for them right now, that's maybe a third priority besides making money, keeping in contact with their families at home, and then maybe they'll start thinking about the big political picture.
You talked about, I think that in the next months we will see how these new arrivals, how it's going to the subject, the issue of Cuba is going to be expressed
Right.
in the feelings of the voters, because nothing like that has happened since December 17th. In a way, you said in a previous moment that it might lead to a restructuring of institutional systems. And at least now, David Curbelo, Díaz Balar, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Bob Menendez, some of them with different positions and levels of influence, they are all very clear in what they want and what kind of position do they defend.
Right.
Do you think that they might change, like for example, a politician like Marco Rubio, that eventually he might change his speech, his discourse?
Well, I don't know. I think you probably would lose money if you bet that they're going to change their opinions. But I think they're politicians, and they're going to change with their electorate to some degree. I don't know to what degree. I mean, if I had a crystal ball, I probably would say that Ros-Lehtinen would be the one that would be most flexible among all of them.
Really?
Yeah.
I wouldn't have that impression.
Yeah, I know. But I think she actually is the most politica of the bunch. I don't know. I mean, I really can't tell. But I do know that if politicians are elected by a base, I always say that you get the politicians you deserve, because if you don't motivate your base, if you don't change the system, then you are basically letting somebody else run the system for you. So I think that at the grassroots level, I don't see them changing their opinions. They might change their tactics. They might move the battleground from no embargo to something else, or maybe now that I should probably start further back, they'll move it to the embargo as opposed to normalization. Before, the line was at normalization. Now that battle's been lost. They can't unring that bell. They can't go back. Cuba's just not that important for the United States as a whole, for a handful of Congress people.
Kidnapping,
yeah, to take the whole foreign policy initiatives of the United States and say no because we say so. And that's one thing that Obama has managed to do, is make Cuba a national issue, not a 305 issue, which is the zip code, the area code of that area, 305. It is a national issue. Now, is it an important national issue? Not really. So that I don't think that they will have to change their opinions that much. They will just have to try to think what the next battle is going to be. The embargo, it'll probably be the next battle. And they'll try
the trade ban, the travel ban, that kind of things.
Right, that kind of ban. What Obama hasn't done by the time he leaves office will be the next battle. So it really depends as to how well, in this case, the Democratic Party, let's face it, it's going to be see how well the Democratic Party can make the Cuban vote be a vote on Cuba rather than on health care or on transportation in Miami, et cetera. They're going to have to focus more on Cuba. So if they could do that and move a lot of people's votes, to become citizens and then to register and then actually garner their votes, the politicians will change their views, or they will be changed themselves.
The ones that register for voting tend to be more Democrats?
The trend is, if you have a graph, you see the Republicans going down from 87% down to 46%, less than half of the population now among Cubans, and Democrats and independents are going up. So you have, right now, 50-50 Republicans and everything else, Democrats and independents. You can be a Democrat, you can be an independent. So you have a even split in the population now.
To see a change, that's a question, Grenier. I research and I read about U.S.-Cuba relations a lot, and all Cubans in a way are related to the Cuban-American communities a lot. A lot of us have families there, and we're related to. But I wonder how this change is going to happen, because the congressional perspective, Ileana Rosa and all that, people functioned during a lot of years like a mob. That's the word, mafia, that Fidel Castro once And I think it fits because they I wouldn't say it's only them. Congress in general has that kind of problems in certain issues. And what's going to change the kind of influence they're going to look for? In the voters or when big people with a lot of money change their views? We're seeing the National Foundation of Cuban Americans, for example, with, let's say, trying to update their discourse, or Fanjul, a very wealthy man trying to make business in Cuba. What is going to change? The voters, the amount of voters wanting to normalize relations, or also the fact that big people, big money people wants a change?
I think change works at different levels. I think change will happen at the base. It will happen at the base. And we're talking about a very small pond here. We're talking about Miami, that is not the United States. Cuba policies no longer will hinge on Miami. That's one thing that you can quote me on.
It's our luck.
It is not going to be.
How many Cubans outside Miami?
About 60-some% are in Miami. 65% of all Cubans in the United States are in Miami. But the Cuba policy is a national issue.
You don't think it's a Florida policy?
No,
it's a government policy.
But definitely it's a government policy. I've always thought that. Now, Cubans are important in that policy because they're the third largest state in the country. And when you elect presidents, there are certain states that are very, very important.
And Florida is one.
Florida is one of them. And so a solid Republican vote among Cubans is very important for the Republican Party. Now, it used to be that stereotype that we started off with was true. And then on the other hand, the Cuban vote is becoming less important at the state level. There are more Latinos. Puerto Ricans have grown incredibly in Central Florida. They're Democrats as a rule. So the Cuban vote per se is split, and now the other Latino votes is pretty solid Democrat. How is change occurring? In all the ways that you just mentioned. You're going to have a change in the base because of the demographic that's being pushed until the United States changes the Cuban Adjustment Act. The Cubans are continuing to come in very dangerous ways, thinking that tomorrow perhaps they're going to change the law. It's not going to be that quick.
Explain a little bit what's the Cuban Adjustment Act.
The Cuban Adjustment Act was put into place in 1966 as a way to allow Cubans that were coming very rapidly during that period of time to normalize their stay in the United States. So what did that mean? They weren't going to be going back to Cuba, so the Attorney General was given the power to adjust the Cuban population, to make them basically residents after initially 2 years. Now it's 1 year and a day. Cubans arrive in the United States. They in a year and a day become residents of the United States, which gives them an incredible advantage to become citizens, which obviously they're not being taken advantage of in the last 20 years. But that act itself is allowing Cubans to receive a benefit that no other Latin American migration group receives. So until that is changed, you're going to see a continuation of migration, a very healthy continuation of migration.
The Cuban Adjustment Act actually, I would say, creates certain conditions for the Cuban immigration, so it's different from the rest of the Latin American immigration.
It's a huge magnet. I've always said that if you give the same benefits that you give Cubans, and with all due respect to, say, any country that I might mention, say Bolivia, if you give the benefits that you give Cubans to Bolivians, Bolivia would empty out. It would just, because you have, not because Bolivia is not a good place to live, it's just that if you are attracted to the United States that easily and given the benefits the Cubans are given, there's a lot of incentive to go there.
And it takes money to actually fund the Cuban Adjustment Act procedures.
Yes.
And that's paid by the Americans' constituencies.
Yeah, any discourse within the next year or two that deals with immigration, somebody's going to point to the Cuban Adjustment Act and say, how about the Cubans? because Mexicans are being treated in a certain way, and other immigrant groups are being treated in specific ways. How about the Cubans? Now, Cubans are a small number. When in migration in the United States, 80% of immigrants are Mexican. Latino immigrants are Mexican. So when people talk about immigration, they're really talking about Mexicanization of society.
We still see media very hostile to Cuba in Miami. This media in Spanish.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Why is not that changing?
Good question.
Tradition?
I think in terms of the main media outlets, they're still playing to the old guard. Now, partly it's because the old guard is the one that still holds the biggest pot of money in Miami. Something that's very interesting that a lot of analysis that's been done and more needs to be done is that the reality is that you hear a lot about the Cuban enclave. The Cuban enclave is this phenomenon where Cubans have managed to create, kind of reproduce in Miami, a class system that feeds on its own. You know, Cubans exploit Cubans, basically, all the way down the line. You get the Cuban elite, 1% that exploits the managers, that exploits the workforce, that exploits the new arrivals, the elite. So you have an enclave economy, you have an enclave culture where you can live a lot of your life without speaking Spanish. So we think that the Cubans are, and together with the enclave, you hear talk about the Cuban success story. You've always heard this in sociological analysis, the success story. We're finding that the success story stopped around 1980, a little bit after 1980. The folks that came during Mariel, definitely the folks that have come during the special period, the folks that have come in this century are not benefiting from that enclave. The rich Cubans, if you can talk about Cubans that have true capital, you can count on your hands the ones that have come after 1980 and after 1990. That is one of the reasons why the media conglomerates still consider the Cuban community as being the early exiles and cater to the early exiles, is because they're the ones that they see in boardrooms. They're the ones that they see in donating to the candidates. They're the ones that are in their clubs. So it's very, the earlier arrivals and the sons and daughters of those early arrivals that have maintained their class status are still very powerful in Miami. So like in any country like the United States, the people that have the power, that have the money, that have the access, have the media. So they'll wake up though, I mean, eventually.
How to make science in such a hostile condition? And you've done it since 1991.
How to do that? Well, it's fascinating to go back. See, theoretically, there's some interesting dynamics going. If you look at the Cuban Revolution like a natural experiment in history, you know, you have an event that changes everything, changes institutions, changes attitudes, tries to change cultures, tries to change the way people think about each other. There's a before and there's an after. And the further away you are from that moment, the more understanding of that moment people become. People that are leaving Cuba now, coming to Miami for whatever reason, are certainly not leaving for the same reasons than the ones that left right at that cataclysmic, incredibly, earthquake of a moment. So the ones that are coming now have a different attitude about Cuba. They might be the bureaucracy is a pain, and they can't, they have problems with salaries. They might have a bunch of problems, but they're not the same ones. And so as you see the transitions occur, you see people layering themselves. It's kind of an archaeology. In Miami, what you have is an archaeological site.
You are Cuban-American, and I've seen, I don't know if you have the same opinion, that in the Cuban political discourse, Cuban-Americans have been included. For example, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, recently in a press conference between the visit of Pope Francis, talked about how blockade, the embargo, affected Cuban people and the Cuban-Americans. And we see how our embassy now, it used to be an intersection, gather or host events with the Cuban Americans in the United States. And I would read that as an acknowledge from the Cuban government that that community, as much as they are involved in process in Cuba, will be more important and more included, right, if they want to, in the Cuban events in general. What do you think about that? How important could the Cuban American community be for the Cuban foreign policy in the future?
It's very clear that the Cuban American diaspora, right, is becoming recognized as being important for the project of the nation, right? That we do have some things in common. Now, on that side, I think you still have a big generational difference, because there are a lot of Cubans in Miami, mostly, but I'm sure in New Jersey and other places. And the older generation, my parents, in essence, although I'm pretty old, are living in a Cuba that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, in their minds, they're still living in a Cuba that has ceased to exist a long time ago, if it ever existed, because they've idealized it now to a point where it's hard to.
They're very biased,
yeah,
by their own circumstances.
It's nostalgia. It's an element of nostalgia that is real, and unless you come to Cuba to see the real Cuba, you'll live and die in a Cuba that doesn't exist. Now, that is still an element of the diaspora, a large element of the diaspora. But there is an element of diaspora that wants to be engaged in Cuba's future now. Me, academically, I came from, at first I was not interested in Cuba per se. I was raised in South Georgia in the United States. I looked more at the injustices of the system there. And started looking at the labor movement. I worked in trying to write about the labor movement, because class structure in the United States is very skewed towards the very rich and very powerful. So I came to the Cuba, be interested in Cuba per se as being interested in the injustices of a system that is manifested in a variety of ways. So I worked in the labor movement, I worked in the civil rights movement, and guess what? Cuba is an element of that. So I came to the Cuba stuff as somebody that said, that's my country, that's where I feel I'm from. I feel very at home here, to tell you the truth. And I want to study that more, but I was not a Cubanólogo coming right out of college or even interested academically.
That's good.
I came to it as somebody that says, I'm in Miami. As a matter of fact, when I moved to Miami in the late 80s, I published the first academic book on Miami. It's called Miami Now. And it's just because I was very curious to learn more about Miami, because it was very strange. I used to make fun of Cubans in Miami when I did not live in Miami. And then when I got to Miami, I began to understand, well, you really can't disrespect a lot of these histories that I have been not respecting. I don't agree with their strategy at their life goals and strategy, but I began to understand my father's and mother's generations a lot more living in Miami than I did abroad, because I mean in the other parts of the country, because I could be more removed from their daily life. But in Miami, you run across people right next to each other that have come recently and have come 50 years ago, and they're talking to each other as Cubans, and that's a very significant event, that they all sense this Cubanness, whether they came 150 years ago or just arrived.
Do you think you're more included now, Cuban Americans in Cuba?
Definitely, there's a more inclusive sense to the diaspora and the country of Cuba now. Whether you're abroad or whether you're not, you feel like you can participate more.
No, and you said you feel very like at home in Cuba. And I know that, I would say too much. You have this hobby of walking and going through all those distances. And you walked from Baracoa to Bayamo?
Yes, I have
Why?
Dream. Why? That's not
Why
a good.
someone
That's not a
would
question
do
you
that?
ask somebody that loves to do this stuff because it's there, you know.
But it's hard
Well, let me
difficult.
I don't know the real existential why, but I do know that I started doing long distance treks in Europe. I like to do long distance walks. You really get to know people and really get to know towns. So
Not
yes,
as a
I've walked
tourist.
from Baracoa. I have an idea. What I want to do is I want to walk Cuba from tip to tip. Why? I don't know. I think that when you walk into a little town, Imias, and you're a sociologist like me, and then you're also interested in people, you find great differences between people in Imias in southeastern Cuba and Havana.
And you're trying to do more, Grenier. You want to like follow or redo the slave route, and you're using like probably the best literature piece of that, Biografía de un Cimarrón, of the very well-known and prestigious intellectual Miguel Barnet, a writer and anthropologist.
Yes.
What is that you're trying to do? You're going back into Cubanidad, you're trying to regain the years you were not here.
I think that book, number one, is a very emotive book. It brings, from that book you can radiate the discourses on identity, discourses on Cubanidad, independencia, nationalism. It's a very,
resistance.
It's a very pregnant book, as we say. You know, it's got a lot in it, right? And so next year is the 50th anniversary of his publication in 2016. So Miguel Barnet, who I've known for several years, I suggested to him that we should do a camino del Cimarrón, a route that kind of traces the life of Esteban Montejo. And
the character of the book.
The person who he interviewed, that's the last, there were other slaves, but this guy was very lucid and he was 103 years old when Miguel interviewed him, and leaves us an incredible testimony about slavery and independence and struggles. I recommended to him that we create a route that traces the life of the character Esteban Montejo, the slaves that he interviewed. And so we're working on that.
Are you thinking about coming back to Cuba? I mean, it would be logic.
Yes, it would be the Calle de la Mata, right? But yes, and I'm exploring that possibility because I think that now there is transnationalism is in the air, right? And I've always felt that not being here, I was not quite whole. And so I think that there's certainly a possibility that I will, there's almost a certainty that I will live here at some point in the future. And I can't tell you exactly when that'll be, but yes, I think that's my camino in the future, yeah.
Well, I suggest you to come back because good Cubans will always be welcome in this island. Thank you so much, Professor. It's been a privilege.